My name is Peter Himmelstein, and I'm a board member at A+D. I have my own office here in Los Angeles called the California office. I've been in Los Angeles for about 6.5 years. 6 years of that time, I worked at Gensler. I came to Gensler from New York. In New York, I worked for Diller, Scofidio, Renfro, DSR. I worked for David Rockwell and Roman and Williams. I also had my own office for many years. So, so here I am again with my own office in LA, which I'm pleased at, and so maybe you can also introduce yourself now.
Yeah, I'm Matthew Gillis. I'm the principal of Gillis, which is a kind of design and research studio.
Yeah.
I also have a commercial side, which is Grant Gillis, that drives the process a little bit.
Yeah.
I came to LA a long time ago, and I worked for a firm, Griffin Enright Architects, for quite a few years, about 10 years, before starting to teach a little bit at Woodbury University.
Yeah.
And really start the kind of my own practice and work along with Gillis, and then Grant Gillis in 2017. And the teaching at Woodbury has been ongoing, and it's how I brought in Parsa Rezé with the project, and how she was involved, and we collaborated on this project.
That's right. That's right. Where are you from before you came to LA?
I was at, came out of Florida, University of Florida, brought me out here to UCLA grad school.
Yeah.
Grad school in architecture, and then went abroad a bit, worked for Kub Himmelbau, and spent some time, 2 years down in Guadalajara with them on a series of projects down there. Mm-hmm. And then came back to the US to keep practicing and try to make my own way, and had an opportunity to work with John and Margaret and in the early stages of their office. So that was really quite compelling to be there.
Yeah.
In that practice.
I'm just going to jump ahead to one question because it's just foremost in my mind. So you have this commercial practice, and then you have your Gillis practice.
Correct.
And how, do they inform each other in any way?
They are starting to, because we're just got institutional work, which came out of some of the institution's interest in the design sensibility that, for example, using the materiality of these plastics that I've been using in Gillis, and manipulating industrial store off-the-shelf materials into complex geometries and forms. We're now doing that with clay with an institution. We're in the very early stages of it, but we're reaching out to industrial clay producers to build large-scale apertures and elements, again, in a material process that leads over from where Gillis has allowed me to really focus on experiments, do installations, exhibitions through academia, and organizations like the A+D.
Yeah.
Years ago, one of the first projects I did was when the AIA had taken over the A+D Museum across from the Wilshire, at the Wilshire spot, and I did one of the 2x8s exhibitions for the student work from the 8 schools around Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And that really kicked off a lot of the material studies, because that was 2012, 2013, and really starting to thermoform objects and elements within spaces, and really challenge the relationship between the way the body and the display of something works, and how we might engage displays in a way more active process than currently just mounting stuff to a wall, or traditionally just mounting stuff to a wall and putting it on display. And that's where this really is coming out of, this interest in this material characteristics allow me to look at, not only, kind of digital techniques of fabrication, manipulative physical techniques of fabrication with the actual materials, but also maybe potentially engaging culturally or socially or experientially with the materials, and always trying to push that scale. Again, like it's interesting that we're both the floor and the wall here with this piece, right? Which I liked a lot, that the A+D had really given these categories.
Yeah.
That like, okay, this is way more interesting of defining elements of the design process that we're actually trying to solve or trying to engage, as we think about them beyond more than kind of, oh, it's an interiors, or it's a building, or, you know, I think these new definitions are kind of the way we're working with materials and seeing what we can do to question those boundaries and definitions, either the definition of the material, or in this case, both the material and how we made threshold within the space in a couple of ways.
So, you know, one of the unfortunate aspects of the pandemic is that I've never laid my hands on your project. I have no tactile sense of it. I didn't get to experience it. And so tell me a little bit more about the material itself, because now that you're talking, I realize that I don't know what the hell it's made of. So tell me about that.
It's a polyethylene film with a metal sandwiched, that sandwiches, there's a couple layers of polyethylene film sandwiching a metal film. So it's basically you're probably most familiar with this kind of material if you've ever gotten a computer equipment that comes in the static free bags. It's that kind of equipment. That's the material right there. So you can get these, like, interestingly, a lot of the products I've gotten that I've challenged, I've ordered from these like industrial supply places, right? So we got bolts of this material and rolled it, and we made a floor out of this material one time. Actually, those are the two projects, a floor and then now a column, or a pseudo column out of this material.
How you know? But just forgive me, but like, how rigid is this? Like, when I touch this thing, does it move? Is it, or is
no?
it
was static, because we digitally modeled it and unrolled it, so that we have a series of rings within it that were brass rings, bent brass, that tied it. Once we did the kind of fluting to the project, we then kind of like skewered it in a series of layers, like a traditional column would be stacked with these drums on top of each other. So we were kind of tying into that methodology. So we had to like weave in those brass rings to kind of make it rigid, but it pretty much was pretty stiff. Now you could go up and it could get bent or wrinkled.
Is it ductile? Like, yeah. Is it flexible when you touch it lightly, or is it to feel rud?
No, yes, the traditional material would crinkle, right? There's those bags, but the way in which we started to do those flutes and pleat it, it stiffened it, right? So it was pretty rigid. You could dimple it if you wanted to, absolutely. It didn't seem anybody did. I think the reflective nature of it had you stepping back constantly with it instead of actually touching it, which was a kind of nice surprise. It's kind of what we wanted to happen. And the idea of the mirror and reflective quality was meant to distort the image of the body and kind of play a little bit of a game with that. And then as you went into the interior, there was a mirrored kind of ceiling, which that was pure mirror. So that was just distorted by geometry, not by the material itself.
So how did you make the cut?
The cut was, again, we unrolled it digitally, and then the cut wasn't CNC'd or anything like that, but the cut was then laid out on templates and cut out. And as we fluted it, it just fell back into the place in which we had it. So there's a series of drawings on the awards plates that shows we got pretty close. There was a couple moments where we have to finish the rings
Yeah.
with a kind of button or the kind of, and it didn't exactly line up the way we had predicted, but I think it worked pretty good.
Yeah, no, it looked good. I mean, no, I mean, I looked at everything. What and yeah, so I mean, I like. I mean, no, it looked like a nice, convincing like drape, and then, but like what I don't understand is that when you kind of fluted it, when it's sort of wrapping around itself like those figure eights. So, like, how is that? Like, how exactly is that created? Is it like manually done on kind of rollers or something, or is it?
Yeah, that's just, so we had in the site, that was at WUHO Gallery in Hollywood. We were able to take over the space for about a week before, to make this. And so it was a series of tables and jigs and slowly manipulating the material with the brass was pre-bent.
Yeah.
So that we could use that also as a guide to make sure we were staying in the geometry.
So it really is a combination of, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it really is a combination of kind of a handcrafted object with this sort of exotic material.
Yeah. I mean, yes, that's correct. And the digital just as an information or a tool to help us achieve the craft part, correct. Mm-hmm. There wasn't an ambition in this one to let the digital technology define the fabrication. It was because the relationship to the chiton, the draped dress from the period of the Greeks, right, was a very natural way in which material acts, right? So we weren't trying to impose any agenda on top of the material, and it has this, because it comes in a roll and it has a fabric-esque quality, we're able to let it operate the way it wants to operate, and not force it against itself. And so the digital just let us make these complex draperies and figure out how to get flat sheets to turn into that. But yeah, it was definitely crafty and a lot of tedious rolling and folding over a few days to get that piece to work.
Yeah. And let me, one of the questions here is what made you select this project for the awards? But I'm kind of curious if there was other things you considered to submit.
Well, it's the most recent, prior to the COVID. It was the last thing on the burner.
I see.
It was a temporary exhibit, so we were trying to give it a life afterwards, right?
Yeah.
All that, month or so of development, week of fabricating, and then up for a weekend for symposium, right? It's kind of heartbreaking a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think, in the process, we've already moved on to another, we've moved into ceramics. Ceramics is now the thing on the boards in the office. And we're working through a series of porcelain and terracotta pieces. So that will be that's just what's going to be focused in the office as we move forward. And what's interesting enough is even though we're transitioning between materials, we're still dealing with stacking of kind of circular elements because we're starting with ceramic pipes. And it's kind of like, I think it just happened to be the project that was completed at the time that the awards happened. I imagine we're going to submit our future projects for board. I don't know if it's in the same category, but because we're trying to go bigger now that we're going bigger than a column, we're making almost an entire interiors out of this stuff. So,
and I like that in your CCC column that it's sort of rooted in history, but it's kind of this innovative reinterpretation of it. And are you, maybe you can tell me a little bit about what your approach to clay and terracotta, because is it sort of similar in that regard?
Absolutely. So I do always try to connect to history, whether we're trying to deny it or appreciate it, right? CCC obviously appreciates it and plays a little, word game with it a little bit. As we move on to other materials, we're going to challenge their position. So everything's getting manufactured in Phoenix, and there's a big Indian culture that talked about terracotta working the land and the arts and crafts there at that time. So we're bringing it in that, and I don't know yet. It's still like it's in that design process. So you're kind of throwing ideas at the materiality. You're trying to root it in a very clear agenda for having a critical statement about its position as a material, its position as how we're applying it. So it's a series of walls. So what does it mean to make walls out of clay? What does it mean to make with clay? What does it mean to fire clay versus not firing clay, and all these kinds of attributes. But that history of making, whether it's an aesthetic or it's a tectonic, is, we're always open for those discussions. That's on the table. And I think that's why I enjoy working with the students, because they're bringing a new, especially younger students, they're bringing pretty interesting, fresh observations that now that I've been doing this for quite a while, I'm looking for, okay, how can I think about this material in a different way? Because I have a very traditional training in architecture, very plastic training in architecture. So I want to do that, but so the graphic sensibilities of it, the kind of tongue-in-cheek, not irony in any sense, not trying to be that, but at least having some playfulness with its history of the material or the history of the object, right? Because the materiality has very little history with the CCC, but the drapery does, and we can get drapery out of the material. The column itself was a permanent or a more permanent marble thing, and we had something that was a very temporary. So we are playing with these contrasts in that project, and they probably will do that in a latter. An earlier project with plastic as well challenged the idea of a display wall as a wall, and we made it a 3D form in the space that you actually moved around, and the plastic deformed based on the people's movement around the space.
Yeah.
The 2x8 tot project. And so every time, like, how did each of these elements potentially operate on it, influence whatever that material it is, and maybe that material hopefully will influence how we actually use it or function with it. So like right now in the clay, we're making these things large enough that they're starting to make apertures in the ceiling of this interior renovation we're doing. And so now what does it mean to push through an envelope with this material and make the skylight or these apertures work through this material? And so we're trying to question, well, is it still a skylight? Is it something else? How do we engage it? Does the clay, which is a vessel, which often was vessels that hold water or hold other things, is we start to think about the clay purely as volume at an architectural scale, not as an object within the architectural scale. So we start to, we try to throw a lot at it, and hopefully one or two of the elements that we're engaging will spark a relationship that everybody can appreciate. I mean, that's our.
You said that you use the film, the other material, as a floor.
Yeah, I made a Nightingale floor. So I took it.
What do you mean? What's a Nightingale floor? What's that?
So I took a group of students to Japan for a summer at Woodbury, and one of the palaces had these floors that squeak, sound like birds, and it was a security device for the elite. So because they have sliding doors, very open villas and palaces, and so it was a security measure, because only some areas that did the elite walk on, and the servants always walked on these other areas. And so at night, if you heard squeaking, it meant someone was not supposed to be where they're supposed to be.
Is it called a Nightingale floor?
A Nightingale floor, yeah. They basically would do big timbers, and they would anchor the timbers with iron nails, but they would bend the nails so that the nails weren't all the way in the board. So when you stepped on the board, it would bend the nail and create the squeak. So we laminated, I think it was 3,000 different scaled size dog squeaks that we also bought that were plastic as well. and made sandwiches of this thing. So we made basically a kind of a maze where you could make it through the floor without squeaking, but it was pretty impossible to do. So it was 30, 40 people in this small gallery space, and just squeaky dog toys going off for a couple hours. So again, trying to cultures, transforming conventions in a way to kind of engender them with some some playfulness. I mean, that's really how we like to think about it.
I'm just kind of curious, how does the material hold up when you have 30, 40 people walking over it, or lots of people walking over it?
Not too bad. That was a project I collaborated with Claret Cup, and there was a lot of, we really built up that floor pretty well. All of this material is recyclable, so we were able to pull, I mean, not really, even people were there with heels. I don't remember any damaged, punctured elements, but we were able to pull everything apart, send it back to the manufacturer. They'd send you these bags to kind of recycle this material, and you can give it back to them, and they grind it back up and put it back through the process. But it was pretty resilient. I mean, it isn't a floor you want to work on, but as a
kind of curious,
as a playful surface, it's quite fun. So
why did you gravitate toward architecture and design, or when did you begin to feel this uncontrollable urge to be an architect designer, and when do you think that you kind of began to like hit stride, that your work began to represent, I think, what you might call your like mature self or something? Yeah,
I think well, I stumbled into architecture. Like I knew, kid want to be an architect, go to school, and I had University of Florida was an excellent program, a very modernist, make models, build things.
Is it in Gainesville? Where is it?
Gainesville, that's correct. And so I liked that making and use of materials, and lots of models representing it, not just drawing, but models. And that really became exciting. It took me to Europe for a semester, and then I saw, I was in Florida, so there wasn't much architecture there. When I went to Europe, saw architecture, and I saw its capacity, and I knew I had to leave Florida, and that's why I came out to California. And at the time, it was the primary digital place. You either go to New York or LA. And I didn't have any digital training. It was all ink on Mylar at Florida. So I wanted to see if that capacity could be made and work with. And obviously there were people out here doing that. And that's what drove me. And even as I went abroad, a little bit less making with the Himmelstein, but with John and Margaret, we were constantly doing installations and installs as well, and challenging materials at that office. And so it was a natural fit as I started breaking out on my own, that the first project was that 2x8 tot that really started to say, okay, I'm working with a material agenda that's challenging the conventions of materials, and even challenging the relationship between the digital and the analog, and maybe have a simultaneous role, not just relying heavily on one or the other in the process.
Well, tell me more about the 2x8 with a project. Like what, because I don't know that much about that.
Right. So that was a series of masses. There are 2x8, but there's actually more schools involved than that. And so you got 2 students from every school, and I aggregated those into kind of a school, like a fish school, set of forms that move through a space. And then I was wrapping those, and at that point I was using things like digital software to form find these elements and produce these forms that then were lit from the inside. So in the end, there was no light in the museum. It was just, and they were night exhibit. These things were glowing. The student work was backlit. So everything was these kind of complicated forms with these backlit surfaces and drawings, beautiful drawings by the students. And that seemed to be like, okay, I'm somewhere. It was at a small scale, wasn't at a building scale, Finally starting to see the building scale now, in that relationship between the commercial office and Gillis are starting to kind of, the trajectories are starting to intersect a little bit. And that's, I don't know, I'd say I haven't found my stride yet, but I think I can
Well,
see the downhill portion coming up a little bit. I'm hoping, right? Like,
yeah, I can sympathize with that. I think it took me a long time to kind of feel like kind of kind of feel like where I began to sort of see the light, where I began to feel, a kind of confidence in what I did, and it was just but it was a long journey through the fog, before that fog sort of lifted.
no, that's true. Like now it's more about seeing where the opportunity to apply some of these ideas, right? Like being more intelligent about, okay, don't spin your wheels here because this project, and that's been part of the lesson between splitting my time between a kind of traditional practice and then this research practice, is to kind of, okay, when can I be strategic? When do I accept a commission, or when do I propose an installation so that I get as much as I can out of it to keep pushing the agenda of the office forward. So that's maybe more comfortable now, right? Like to see when is it appropriate to be challenging these ideas, and when is it appropriate just to put your head down and get the job done kind of work. So
I like your brand identity with your exclamation points, and I just like it. But is there something that I should know about this?
no, it's the bad graphic designer in me, maybe trying to try to flip the eyes upside down and maybe get an emotional response out of people, which is the experiential response that I want people to have with the projects I do. So it was just a very off the cuff way of trying to achieve that, and it stuck. And
well, it does work, because it's like, if you're like I feel like I should say your name, Gillis, like not Gillis. Like I feel like I need to
perfect.
Yeah, like
it's like, okay, should you say it with a smile or with emphasis, right? Like those are the two questions.
So it sounds like a lot of the students, just like their kind of intellectual curiosity and their and their youth and enthusiasm, like actually really informs your point of view and your practice. Was that fair?
And I would say, like with Parsa, we're working on the project, trying ideas out. She was doing a lot of the physical making and model making for the project. But it would go back and forth, and we'd challenge each other. And I think over the years, I've had different students that do that work with me for a summer or for a semester. And I try to treat it, hopefully they're ambitious enough that they want to engage in that way.
Yeah.
They feel comfortable enough to be part of the collaboration of the design process, right? Because sometimes you just get too deep in it and you need to step back, and it's nice to have that help to kind of, what's going on here? What if we, I just saw this YouTube video of this comedian and he was dancing around with this dress, and so then that becomes like, oh, how do we get it to make that relationship? How do we get in there? So it becomes a dialogue with the experiences of everybody involved on the design team. And it just happened to be the two of us on this project. Some of them have had as many as 3 or 4. Actually, I guess the one taught had people from both SciArc and Otis working on that project. So,
go ahead.
Yeah, I think I will always try to bring them in. It's also there is some training going on, like some obligation to, I learned a lot working under architects. I learned a lot more working on architects than I necessarily did under the education system. So I kind of feel obligated to, when they come in the office, we're keeping that kind of teaching atmosphere going. That in the experimental and research office really affords that ability to do that.
What role do you think the A+D Museum can have? And do you think, if you were going to give your advice, like in terms of its evolution, like what would it be? Like, I mean, because I think that's interesting that you feel that it would probably be great if it could have some kind of real presence in the city.
Absolutely. And I mean, well, architecture still is a physical thing to me. I mean, it's a material practice for me. So
Yeah.
I think it need like a space dedicated to it online is great. And it's excellent, and it's a place for dialogue and discourse. But a place to experience, nascent ideas in architecture that are in a material practice need to be able to see and touch the material, or
Yeah.
be aware of its relationship to your body. And so I hope it manifests at least in temporary pop-up installations, and I would absolutely be attending those to see what's going on, who's doing what, in the design and architecture community.